The ice on Cedar Hollow Lake didn't just crack, it groaned like something dying. On a bitter February evening, deep in the snowbound backcountry of Vermont, 28-year-old Delia Hartwell hauled 3 small, shivering lives out of the black, freezing water, never imagining that the figure sinking beneath the shattered ice was a man half of New England was hunting. She'd once been an ER nurse in Chicago, until the day she dared to report a powerful doctor and got herself blacklisted out of the entire profession, stripped of her job and everything she'd built. Now she was just a single mother with chestnut hair tied back in a hurry and tired gray eyes that had never once learned how to quit. Scraping by as a traveling vet out of a lakeside cabin the bank was about to seize, raising her 6-year-old daughter Pippa, who fought asthma every winter. She was used to loss, used to the cold, used to the fact that nobody ever came to rescue her. So when the panicked cries of puppies tore through the snow, she didn't stop to think, she just ran. A black SUV had punched through the thin ice and was already going under. Delia grabbed a coil of rope, lashed it to a wooden post, and threw herself into water so cold it felt like it was peeling the skin from her bones. One by one she dragged them out, the first one easy, the second tangled in a seatbelt, the third nearly gone until she pressed her hands to its tiny chest and worked until it coughed and came back to life. And just when she thought it was over, a human hand slapped weakly against the sinking glass. There was one more soul down there. She dove a final time, locked her arms around a heavy, broad-shouldered man, and when she dragged him onto the snowbank, she froze. Beneath his torn, expensive coat was a bullet wound bleeding from his side. This was no accident. This man with his hard, square jaw, the faint scar along his jawline, and eyes the cold gray of steel hadn't simply driven off the road. Someone had wanted him dead. And Delia Hartwell, a woman with nothing left to lose, had just pulled an entire deadly underworld straight into the middle of her living room. If you love stories about courage and broken souls finding each other against all odds, hit that like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with the people you care about. And subscribe to the channel today so you never miss what happens next. The man was as heavy as a fallen tree, and Delia knew that if she hesitated for even one more minute, both of them would freeze to death on this lake shore. The biting cold fought her at every turn, making every movement a test of sheer will as she forced her grip to hold the rope. She staggered to her feet in the shrieking wind, dragging his unconscious body away from the edge of the cracking ice, inch by inch, her heels sinking deep into the packed snow. Her old wood-hauling sled was still propped beside the ancient pine, where she had left it when she ran out, and she thanked heaven for the careful habits of someone who had lived alone for far too long. She rolled the man onto the wooden planks, his head lolling back, his lips already turning a bluish purple that Delia, with all her years in the emergency room, understood far too well. It was the color of someone slipping toward the other side. The 3 trembling puppies clung to her legs, soaked through and whimpering, and she had no hands left to carry them, so she could only tuck all 3 inside the front of her heavy coat, pressing them against her chest to share with them the last bit of warmth she still had. Then she began to pull. The distance back to the cabin was only a few hundred yards, but in the roaring snowstorm, it felt as long as an entire lifetime. Snow lashed her face in waves as sharp as needles. The wind blew straight against her until every step became a battle, and the rope cut into her torn palms so painfully that she had to clench her teeth to keep from crying. There was a moment, only one moment, when her knees buckled, and a tiny voice inside her head whispered that she couldn't do it, that this man was a stranger, that Pippa was still asleep inside the house, and she had no right to die out here for someone she had never met. But then the old instinct rose up, the instinct that had been bred into her blood through all the years she had worn a white coat, the instinct that never asked who the person lying in front of her was, whether he deserved to be saved or not, but asked only one question: was he still breathing? And he was still breathing, so she got up. She gathered every last bit of strength left in a 28-year-old body that had grown far too used to carrying burdens, and she pulled. The cabin door appeared through the snow like a pale yellow lighthouse, firelight from the hearth spilling through the frost-covered window panes. Delia slammed her shoulder into the door, shoved it open, and a wave of warm air rushed out to meet her like an embrace. She dragged the sled over the threshold, wood scraping against wood with a harsh creak. Then with one final effort that made darkness swim before her eyes, She rolled the man down onto the braided rug in front of the stone fireplace. He lay there, large and motionless, ice melting into puddles beneath his body, and for the first time in the firelight, Delia saw clearly who was. An angular face, a square jaw, skin gone pale from the cold, yet still carrying a cold authority even in unconsciousness. She didn't allow herself to stop and think. She rushed to the landline phone hanging on the kitchen wall, snatched up the receiver, and heard only dead silence. The line had gone out when the storm began knocking down the old utility poles along the lake. She pulled her cell phone from the pocket of her soaked pants, and the screen showed no signal, exactly as she had expected, because in this remote corner, reception was already unreliable, and a storm like this had severed her last thread to the outside world completely. The only road into town was 12 miles away and almost certainly buried in snow. No ambulance could reach them before morning, and by then this man would have gone cold long ago. Delia stood in the middle of her small wooden house, water dripping steadily from her hair onto the floor, the 3 puppies trembling against her feet, and she understood a raw, naked truth, that tonight, in this lonely cabin beside the frozen lake, she was the only person standing between that strange man and death. No police, no hospital, no one else. Only her torn hands, and whatever she still remembered from the old life that had been taken from her. She drew in a deep breath, swept her wet hair back, and knelt beside him. Her hands, though numb with cold, still moved automatically to the pulse point in his neck, and that weak, sluggish beat sounded beneath her fingertips like a plea for help. The first problem was the cold, because Delia knew hypothermia would kill him faster than any wound. She stripped away the soaked coat, plastered to the man's body, working the freezing buttons with focused urgency, then dragged every wool blanket she owned from the cabinet and wrapped them around that large body, the way one might swaddle a newborn child. She pulled him even closer to the fireplace, added more wood until the flames roared fiercely, and placed the bricks she always warmed to heat the bed on both sides of his torso, wrapped in cloth so the warmth would seep in slowly, without burning skin that had gone numb from the cold. She did all of it through the memory of her hands, without needing to think, because there had been a time when she had done these things every night, beneath the cold white lights of the emergency room, before they took away her license and her honor along with it. Only when the purple color on his lips began to fade, a little did she dare turn to the wound. She pulled her mobile veterinary emergency bag closer, the faded canvas bag that held everything she needed to treat the cows, horses, dogs, and cats from the scattered farms around the lake, and she told herself that a body was a body. Flesh and blood were flesh and blood, whether human or animal. The principles of stopping bleeding remained the same. She cut away the soaked shirt at his side, and what appeared beneath the firelight made her hold her breath for a moment. The wound was deep, savage, and Delia had seen enough in her life to know at once that this was the mark of a bullet. Blood was still seeping out slowly, soaking through the icy crust still clinging to his skin, spreading into a dark stain beneath the flickering light. She pressed a thick stack of gauze over it, bearing down with all her weight to slow the bleeding, and she counted each beat in her head as she always had, 1, 2, 3, until the flow began to ease. The bullet was still inside. She could feel that through her fingertips, and she knew she had no choice but to take it out before it caused infection and stole his life from within. She sterilized her medical forceps in the flames until the metal tip glowed red, then poured alcohol over both the wound and her trembling hands. She had no anesthetic, nothing to soften the pain she was about to cause, and all she could do was whisper to the unconscious man that she was sorry, that this was going to hurt badly, that he had to endure it if he wanted to live. The moment the forceps touched the wound, the man reacted even through unconsciousness. His entire body went rigid, his back arched up from the rug, and a low, guttural groan tore from his throat, sounding like the growl of a beast driven into a corner. His teeth clenched hard, every muscle in his body rigid with pain, and his large hand groped through the air before suddenly catching Delia's wrist, squeezing so tightly she thought her bones might break. She didn't pull away. She had been grabbed by panicked patients before, clawed at, clung to, screamed at, and she knew that behind that desperate strength was only a human being afraid of death. "Hold on to me," she said softly, her voice strangely calm amid the storm howling outside. "You can hold on to me if you need to, but I'm not going to stop." And she didn't stop. With a precision that only years of harsh training could bring, She extracted the bullet, dropped it with a sharp clink into the metal bowl beside her, then cleaned the wound and began to stitch, one suture at a time, her hands steady even though her heart was pounding like a war drum. Throughout it all, the man kept sinking and rising through delirium, and from his dry, cracked lips, broken words occasionally spilled out in a language Delia didn't understand, heavy, sharp syllables from some Eastern European tongue, sometimes sounding like a warning, sometimes like a name called out in despair. She didn't know what he was saying, but she heard the pain inside it, and pain didn't need translation. When the final stitch was done, Delia dropped heavily onto the floor, her back leaning against the leg of a chair, sweat soaking her, even though the room was still cold. She looked at the strange man, his breathing now a little more even, and she knew she had just pulled him back from the edge of the abyss, but only by one small step. He had lost too much blood, his body had endured the cold for too long, and fever was beginning to rise hot beneath his skin. He was still far from safe, and Delia understood that tonight was only the beginning. Time inside the cabin passed to the labored rhythm of the strange man's breathing, and Delia sat there with her knees drawn up, her back against the leg of the chair, not daring to take her eyes off him. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, throwing streaks of amber and orange light across his shadowed features as he sank deeper into fever. And the longer Delia looked, the more she felt unease rising in her chest like water swelling beneath a sheet of ice. She had spent her whole life saving people, but she had never saved a man with a bullet wound in his body. People didn't get shot for no reason. People didn't drive an expensive car into a frozen lake in the middle of the worst storm of winter for no reason. Not in a lonely place even the locals avoided when the weather turned, and the clothes he wore, though torn to pieces and soaked through, still revealed fabric so expensive that someone like her wouldn't have dared dream of it in a lifetime, while the watch on his wrist was heavy and cold and worth more than the house she was sitting in. This man didn't belong to the world of poor farms scattered around Cedar Hollow Lake. He came from somewhere dark and dangerous, and Delia felt a chill run down her spine at the thought that whoever had shot him wouldn't stop hunting him just because he had gone under the water. She tightened her grip, resting her chin on her knees as her memories came back without permission. Chicago. That name echoed in her mind now like an old scar aching whenever the weather changed. She missed the emergency department, the fast-paced adrenaline, and the pride of wearing a white coat. But that life had been brutally stripped away just because she chose her conscience over silence. Now, those memories only sharpened the bitter contrast between her past and the bleeding stranger on her rug by healing livestock instead of human beings. And she had told herself that all she needed was peace, a roof over Pippa's head, nothing more. But even that small thing, the world wouldn't let her keep. The bank notice still lay on the kitchen table, where she had set it down 3 days ago, and hadn't found the courage to touch it again. That cold sheet of white paper and black ink telling her she had very little time left before they came to take away this cabin, the last home she and her daughter had. And now, as if fate hadn't tormented her enough, it had thrown a strange man across her threshold, dragging behind him an entire world she had never wanted to be involved in. She looked at him, the large man lying motionless on her rug, and one question kept repeating in her mind like an alarm bell. Who had she just brought into her home? Who was he? Who were the people hunting him? And when this night was over, would she have to pay for her kindness with Pippa's safety? In the corner of the room, the 3 puppies had long since fallen asleep, curled into one another in a warm little pile of fur, and their innocent peace only sharpened the unease gnawing at Delia. She couldn't sleep. She didn't dare sleep. She only sat there, watching over the stranger's breathing, listening to the storm howl outside, and waiting for dawn with the heavy feeling that when the sun rose, she would have to face answers she perhaps had never wanted to hear. She didn't know that the answer would come sooner than she imagined, and that it would change everything. She must have dozed off without realizing it, because the next thing she became aware of was barking, sharp and urgent, tearing through the night and dragging her out of her fitful haze. The 3 puppies had sprung up from the warm little pile of fur in the corner, and they were no longer the tiny exhausted creatures they had been only a few hours earlier. They were lunging toward the hallway that led to Pippa's bedroom, barking in rapid bursts, their claws scraping against the wooden floor, all 3 turning their heads toward Delia, and then back toward the half-closed door, as if trying to tell her something desperately urgent. The mother in Delia woke faster than reason ever could. She shot up from the floor, her knees still stiff and numb from sitting too long, and rushed toward her daughter's room, her heart pounding hard inside her chest. She pushed the door open, and in the faint glow of the nightlight, she saw Pippa sitting up in bed, her small shoulders rising and falling with each strained breath, her tiny hands gripping the blanket, and the familiar wheezing sound Delia feared more than anything in this world coming from her child's chest. An asthma attack. Delia had lived through this moment enough times not to panic, even though her heart was clenching. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her voice immediately shifting into the low, warm, steady tone that only a mother who had also been a nurse could possess, and she spoke to her daughter with words she had said hundreds of times before. "Mommy's here, sweetheart. Breathe with me. Slow now. Nice and slow." She reached for the inhaler waiting on the bedside table, where it always stayed because Delia never left it anywhere beyond arm's reach, and pressed it to her daughter's mouth, counting each beat. Breathe in, hold it, breathe out, while her hands rubbed Pippa's small back in slow circles she knew would help the child calm down. "Look at me, sweetheart," she whispered, eyes on Mommy. "Just you and me. There's nothing to be afraid of," and Pippa looked at her, her wide round eyes still wet with fear, fixed on Delia's face as if it were the only anchor in the world, and little by little, her breathing steadied. The wheezing faded, her small shoulders stopped straining, and at last Pippa relaxed against her mother's chest, exhausted but able to breathe normally again. Delia held her tightly, pressing her cheek to her daughter's soft hair, and only then did she allow herself to tremble for one brief moment with relief. She carried Pippa out to the living room, where the warmth from the fireplace still lingered, because she didn't want to take her eyes off her child again for the rest of the night. And when she laid her daughter down on the couch, near the hearth, and covered her with a blanket, something strange happened that made her freeze. The 3 puppies, who had still been standing watchfully at the threshold, immediately ran over, and without the slightest hesitation, climbed onto the couch and curled around Pippa's small body, one nestling against her feet, one pressing into her side, and the third tucking its head into the hollow near her neck, as if they had silently divided the work of guarding her among themselves. Pippa, still half asleep, slipped an arm around the nearest puppy and smiled as sleep pulled her under again. Delia stood still, watching the scene, and a feeling she couldn't name rose in her chest. Only a few hours earlier, these animals had been struggling in the frozen water, dying entirely unknown to her. Yet now, as if through an understanding beyond human reason, they had chosen. They had chosen this house, chosen this child, chosen to stand with her and her daughter. They were the ones who had woken her in time. Their barking was what had pulled her to Pippa's side before the asthma attack could grow worse. Delia knelt beside the couch and gently stroked one puppy's head, and it licked her hand once before closing its eyes again, completely at peace. She looked over at the strange man still lost in delirium beside the fireplace, the man who had brought these animals into her life, and for the first time since she had dragged him up from the lake, the unease inside her mingled with something else, something more fragile, almost like gratitude. She didn't know who this man was, but his animals had saved her daughter tonight, and that, whether she wanted it or not, had tied her fate to his in a way she didn't yet fully understand. Dawn came to Cedar Hollow Lake in a cold white stillness, the storm having passed in the night and left behind a world buried in snow, silent enough to make the skin crawl, and Delia was still sitting there beside the fireplace, her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night, when she noticed the man begin to move. He didn't wake slowly the way she had imagined he would. He came awake all at once, his steel-gray eyes flying open and sweeping the room with the sharp vigilance of a man used to waking in dangerous places. For one moment that gaze stopped on Delia, and she saw him assess her from head to toe, not with the look of a patient grateful to the person who had saved his life, but with the look of someone calculating whether she was a threat or a pawn. "You're in my house," Delia said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "You were shot, and I took the bullet out. You almost died last night." The man didn't answer at once. He tried to push himself up, and immediately the pain in his side stopped him cold, his face going pale, the muscles along his jaw standing out as he clenched his teeth and swallowed back a groan. Delia caught herself rising by reflex, ready to help him, then stopped, because there was something in this man's bearing that made her afraid to touch him. At that very moment, a phone began to ring. The sound came from the wet coat Delia had draped over a chair to dry near the fireplace, a steady, persistent ringing. It was a heavy, military-grade satellite phone, the kind that didn't rely on local cell towers siped out by the storm. The man snapped his head toward it with an urgency she hadn't seen in him before. "Give it to me," he said, and those were the first words he had spoken, his voice deep and rough, carrying a heavy foreign accent that now, with him awake, was much clearer than the fevered mutterings of the night before. Delia hesitated, then took the heavy device from the coat pocket and handed it to him. He pressed it to his ear, and she heard an urgent voice coming from the other end, but he only answered with a few short sentences in a language she didn't understand, his eyes sharpening with every word. Then he ended the call, and silence fell over the room, heavy as a damp blanket. Less than 10 minutes later, the sound of an engine reached them from the snow-covered road outside, followed by quick, decisive footsteps crunching across the ice, and then a knock sounded at the door. 3 clean, forceful strikes. The puppies sprang up and growled. Delia stood rooted in the middle of the room, her heart pounding, and before she could decide what to do, the man spoke, loud enough to carry through the door, one single word in English. "Marlowe." The door opened, and another man stepped inside, leaner but solid, his cold, careful gaze sweeping the room in an instant, taking in every detail, taking in Delia standing there with her bandaged hands. He crossed the room, dropped to one knee beside the wounded man with a respect Delia could not mistake, and the words he spoke made the blood in her body feel as if it had frozen. "Mr. Vukovich," he said, his voice low and tense, "we've been searching for you all night. Are you all right?" Vukovich. The name struck Delia like a blast of cold wind. She didn't know much about the underworld. She was a nurse from Chicago and a single mother in a country town, but even she had heard that name in passing on the news, tied to ports, shipping routes, investigations that never seemed to go anywhere because witnesses kept disappearing one after another. That name didn't belong to an ordinary man who had been in an accident. It belonged to a force. She stepped back, her spine touching the wall, and she looked at the man she had stayed awake all night to save with completely different eyes. The man, Lazar Vukovich, caught that look, and something passed across his face, not triumph, but almost regret. He understood very well what she had just realized. He let out a faint breath, leaned his head back against the chair, and when he spoke his voice was low, and carried a bitter truth neither of them could deny. "You should let the water do its work, nurse," he said. His intense gaze was fixed on her. "Now both of us are in trouble." And outside, across the endless white snow, Delia knew the door back to her old quiet life had just closed behind her forever. Marlowe stepped outside to watch the road, leaving Delia and the man named Vukovich in a room now filled with a silence completely different from the one that had pressed around them the night before. Delia poured a cup of warm water and set it beside him, not because she was no longer afraid, but because the instinct to care inside her was stronger than fear. And Lazar watched that gesture for a long time as if it were a language he had forgotten how to read. "You have the right to know who you brought into your house," he said quietly, after a while, his voice having lost some of its guarded coldness. "The man who shot me, the man who wanted me dead at the bottom of that lake, wasn't an enemy. He was my own blood." Delia sat down in the chair across from him, her bandaged hands resting on her knees, and she listened. Lazar told it one sentence at a time, in the deep, rough voice of a man too tired to hide anymore. He told her about a family that had immigrated from the distant Balkans, about a father who had built everything from nothing at the ports of New England, about the shipping empire he had inherited along with all its dark secrets. And he told her about Cassius, the cousin he had raised like a younger brother, the man he had trusted with the most important parts of his work, the man he had never once imagined would betray him. "But greed doesn't know blood," Lazar said, his gaze fixed on the fire as if he were looking back at everything he had lost. "Cassius wanted more than his share. He wanted everything, the ports, the routes, the things my father spent his entire life building, and to have them he needed me to disappear in a way that looked natural." He gave a faint laugh, a laugh with no trace of joy in it, an accident, a car sliding off an icy road and plunging into the lake during a storm. No one would suspect anything. No questions would be asked, and Cassius would step in to take over everything with the grieving face of a younger brother who had just lost his elder. He calculated everything. He just didn't calculate that some reckless woman would jump into freezing water and drag me out. He looked up at Delia, and in those steel-gray eyes was something she hadn't expected, a curiosity almost gentle. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "You didn't know who I was. You could have turned away, and no one would have blamed you." Delia was silent for a while, then answered with the simplest truth she had. "Because it's what I do," she said simply. "I don't filter lives based on who deserves it." Lazar tilted his head as she quietly shared the heavy cost of her past honesty. "They had power," she added, her voice barely a whisper, "and the truth wasn't enough to save me then." When she finished speaking, a strange silence settled over the room, and she realized Lazar was looking at her in a completely different way, no longer with the calculating stare of a predator, but with the gaze of someone who had just recognized a kindred sufferer. "A hospital abandoned my sister," he said, and his voice was so quiet that Delia had to lean forward to hear him. "She was sick, and back then we had no money, no Vukovic name that people were afraid of. I carried her to the emergency room doors, and they looked at us like we were two filthy animals, and they made her wait until it was too late. I swore over her body that I would never be powerless again, never let anyone have the right to look down on me like that again." He stopped, and when he lifted his eyes to Delia, something inside those steel-gray eyes had broken. "You spent your life saving people like my sister," he said, "and I spent mine becoming the thing you once stood against." Delia didn't know what to say. The two of them sat there beside the fire, from opposite worlds, and yet both carried wounds from the same system that had trampled them. And outside, beneath the silent snow, the man who had caused all of this was still waiting for word that Lazar was dead. It wasn't until mid-morning, when Delia picked up Lazar's dried coat to fold it neatly, that everything fragile that had just been built between them nearly shattered. Her hand brushed against something hard and heavy hidden inside the inner lining, and before she had time to think, her fingers had already pulled it out. A gun. Black, cold, and so real it made her heart clench. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, the gun lying in her trembling palm, and the whole room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She had let this thing stay inside her home all night, right beside the place where Pippa slept, right beside her precious little girl. The warm sympathy that had just begun to grow between them vanished in an instant, giving way to a cold fear and a surge of anger. "You said you were a victim," she said, her voice trembling, but every word sharp as a blade. "You told me about your sister, about the betrayal. You made me feel sorry for you. But you brought this into my house, into the place where my daughter sleeps. Lazar, who are you? What kind of man are you really?" Lazar didn't blink at the gun pointed in his direction. He only looked at her with a steady gaze, so calm they were frightening. "I'm a man people sent an entire team to kill," he said quietly. "A man in my position who doesn't carry that would been dead long ago. But I've never, and I'll never, pointed at you or your daughter. Delia, that is something I can swear. I want you out of here," Delia said, her voice breaking. "As soon as you can stand, I want you gone. I don't care whether you're a victim or not. I have a child to protect, and I was too foolish when I let a world like yours cross the threshold of my home." She stepped back, set the gun on the table far from his reach, and turned away, her shoulders shaking with all the things she had held back through the long night. A long silence passed. Then Lazar's voice sounded behind her, low and slow. "Do you think Cassius wants me dead only because of the ports?" he said. "If it were only money, he could have divided, negotiated, bought people off. No, he wants me dead because I hold something that can destroy him." Delia turned back, and she saw Lazar forcing himself upright, one hand pressed to his side, searching for something in the remaining lining of the coat she had just dropped. He pulled out a small object, a memory card wrapped in waterproof rubber, and placed it on the table between them as if he were setting down a still-beating heart. "My father was a careful man," he said. "He taught me that in this world the strongest weapon isn't guns or bullets, but recorded truth. For years, I've kept a second set of books, a parallel record of every transaction, every flow of money, every name involved, including those respectable masked people out there that you'd never suspect. Cassius knows it exists. He knows that as long as I'm alive and still have it, he'll never truly be safe, no matter how many ports he takes. That's why he couldn't just push me aside. He had to bury me." Delia looked at the tiny memory card lying on the old wooden table in her house, and she understood that she was looking at something heavy enough to kill for, something people were willing to sink a man to the bottom of a frozen lake to silence. "So you keep it," she said slowly, to protect yourself. To survive, Lazar replied. And perhaps, one day, to do one right thing I've never had enough courage to do. He looked up at her, and the anger inside Delia softened, giving way to a heavy confusion. She was still afraid. She still wanted him to leave her life and take all his danger with him. But she was no longer certain that the man sitting before her was completely the monster she had just wanted to believe he was. She looked at the gun on the table, then at the memory card, two symbols of the same man torn between what he had become and what he perhaps still wanted to be. And deep inside, Delia knew the decision she was about to make would not be nearly as simple as the words she had spoken in anger. That afternoon, when Lazar had fallen asleep from exhaustion and Pippa was sitting by the window drawing, with the 3 puppies gathered around her, Delia stood in her small kitchen, both hands gripping the edge of the sink, and faced the question she had been trying to avoid all day. The snow had stopped falling, and she knew that by tomorrow afternoon, maybe sooner, the road into town would probably be cleared enough for a car to pass. She could drive to the police station. She could tell them there was a man with a gunshot wound lying in her house, a man carrying a gun and an entire world full of death, and she could wash her hands of all of this. She could protect her daughter. That was the most reasonable thing, the safest thing, the thing any clear-minded mother would do. So why wouldn't her feet move? She looked out the window, where Pippa was giggling at a puppy licking the page she had been drawing on, and Delia's heart tightened with love and fear tangled together. If anything happened to that little girl because of her hesitation, she would never forgive herself. But then another thought slipped in, cold and sharp. The police station in a small town like Cedar Hollow only had a handful of people, and Cassius was a man with enough money to sink a human life to the bottom of a lake without anyone knowing. A man who, according to Lazar, had already bought off people hiding behind respectable faces. How could she know that if she walked into that police station and said the name Vukovich, she wouldn't be handing Lazar, and herself, straight into the hands of people on Cassius's payroll? One wrong call, one wrong officer, and both she and her daughter would become witnesses who needed to disappear. She didn't know who to trust. That was the most terrifying thing of all. The feeling of standing in the middle of a world where every door she thought might be an exit could turn out to be a trap. Delia closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw again that night in Chicago many years before. The night she had stood before a choice, not so different from this one. Back then, her conscience had forced her to speak up for a human being whom the entire system had chosen to abandon, and she had paid for it with her career, with her whole life. People had taught her that it had been a mistake, that she should have stayed silent, should have turned away like everyone else. But even after losing everything, even after being crushed, deep in her heart, Delia had never believed that what she had done was wrong. She had taken an oath when she put on that white coat, an oath that she would never turn her back on a person who needed saving, that she would never let the value of a human life be decided by who they were, rich or poor, good or bad, pitiful or frightening. Lazar Vukovich was a dangerous man, a man who had done things she could never condone. But he was also a human being hunted, a human being who, if she pushed him out the door right now, would almost certainly die. And she understood that if she handed him over, not because of justice, but because of fear, because she wanted to cast off the burden, then she would lose the very part of herself that made her who she was, the part that, even when the whole world turned its back, she had refused to let die. She opened her eyes, and she knew the answer. Even though it made her heart feel heavy, she would not hand him over like a piece of cargo. Not because she trusted him, but because she trusted herself. Trusted the principle that this life had tried to strip from her, but had never succeeded in taking away. But that didn't mean she would be naive. She turned back into the living room, where Lazar had just awakened, his steel-gray eyes following her as she came closer. "I won't turn you over to the police," she said, her voice calm but hard. "Not because I trust you. Because I don't trust the system out there more than I trust you. And because I won't become the person who pushes someone toward death just to save myself. But you need to hear this clearly. As long as you're under this roof, my daughter comes first. Above you, above your world, above everything. If there is one moment when you put her in danger, I won't hesitate." Lazar looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes there was a respect she had never seen any man give her before. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he said quietly. and the first person in many years to make me believe that kindness still exists in this world. Marlowe came back into the house as the afternoon light began to fade, bringing with him the outdoor cold clinging to the shoulders of his coat and a new tension carved into a face that rarely softened to begin with. In his hand was Lizer's watch, that heavy, expensive object Delia had taken from his wrist on the first night and forgotten on the shelf, and there was something in the way Marlowe held it that made the whole room sink. "I need you to see this," Marlowe said, placing the watch on the table in front of Lazar. "I noticed something unusual about it, so I opened it." He turned over the back of the watch, and inside, hidden among the delicate gears, was a tiny chip that didn't belong to any timekeeping mechanism, a miniature electronic eye still blinking quietly. Lazar looked at it, and his face darkened like the surface of the lake before a storm. "A tracking device," he said, his voice dropping with danger. "Cassius planted it here. That's how he followed me, how he pushed me onto the lakeside road that night. He didn't leave anything to chance." Marlowe nodded, his expression grave. "But it's worse than that, sir. This chip is still working." Delia, leaning against the kitchen doorway, felt a cold current run down her spine. "So he knows," she said almost in a whisper. "He knows you're here." "Not exactly," Marlowe replied, explaining in the flat voice of a man used to calculating matters of life and death. "The signal is very weak and intermittent, probably because the chip took in lake water, and the cold damaged its battery. It doesn't give an exact location. It only sends out scattered bursts, enough to point to a wide area around Cedar Hollow Lake, not to one specific house, and that is exactly what has saved us until now." He stopped, then continued, and every word he spoke felt like a cold stone dropped into Delia's heart. "All this time, Cassius has believed you were dead. The last signal he received came from the bottom of the lake, exactly according to his plan, and he waited comfortably to take over everything. But now the chip has begun transmitting again, and more importantly, it is moving. From the lake onto shore, into this house. A corpse doesn't walk by itself. The moment Cassius sees that signal move, he'll understand immediately that you're alive, and once he knows you're alive, he'll understand that the incriminating evidence is still somewhere within your reach." Lazar closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them, his gaze had returned to the cold sharpness of a predator driven into a corner. "Then he won't wait anymore," he said for Marlowe. "He'll come." "Yes," Marlowe nodded. "But the signal is too weak to lead him straight to the door. He'll know it's around this lake, but there are dozens of cabins scattered through the woods around the lake. He'll have to send men to search section by section, narrow the area down, check each cabin one by one. That gives us a little time. Not much, one night perhaps. He won't risk bringing men in during the day, while the road still isn't fully clear and they could easily be seen. He'll wait until dark." Delia listened to those words and felt as if the ground beneath her feet had fallen away. One night, that was all she had before the men who had tried to sink a living man to the bottom of a frozen lake came to the very threshold of her home, where her daughter was sleeping. She looked toward Pippa's room, then at Lazar, then at Marlowe, and in that moment, every last trace of hesitation inside her dissolved, replaced by the cold clarity she had once carried through the most brutal emergency cases. "Then we destroy it," she said, pointing to the chip that was still blinking. "Destroy the signal so he won't know exactly." "No," Lazar said, and something flashed in his eyes. "If we shut it off suddenly, he'll know someone found it, and he'll be even more certain that I'm alive and that someone is helping me. Let it keep transmitting. Let him think he's hunting a wounded, isolated prey." He lifted his eyes to Delia, and in that gaze was a resolve as cold as ice. "Because when he comes," he said quietly, "he won't expect that prey to be ready and waiting for him." Outside the window, darkness began to settle over the lake, and with it, a silent countdown had begun. The decision came to Delia at once, without a single second of hesitation, because amid all the dangers tightening around the house, there was only one thing that was absolute to her, and that was that Pippa had to be out of there before night fell. She didn't allow herself to imagine any version of events in which her daughter was still inside this house when those men arrived. She pulled Marlowe into a corner, her voice urgent but not trembling, the voice of a mother who had fully crossed into a state where only one task in the world remained. "About 5 miles west of here, there's an old woman named Esther," she said. "She lives alone, she's kind, and she's far enough from this lake that no one will think of her. I need you to take my little girl there right now, while it's still light and the road can still be crossed. I need you to swear to me that you'll place her directly into that woman's hands and that you won't let anything happen to her." Marlowe looked at her for a moment, then nodded, a slow, certain nod from a man who understood the weight of the promise he was about to make. "I'll get the child somewhere safe," he said, "and I'll come back before dark. You have my word." Lazar, from the chair by the fireplace, spoke up, his voice low and firm. "Marlowe is the only person in this world I trust completely," he told Delia. "If there's one man who can keep your daughter safe, it's him." Delia looked into Marlowe's eyes, and though she had only known him for one day, she saw in them a hard honesty her instincts chose to trust. She nodded, then she went into the room, where Pippa was sitting among the 3 puppies, and she knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes, forcing a smile onto her face though her heart was breaking. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "tonight you're going to visit Miss Esther for a little while, all right? She has lots of ginger cookies, remember?" Pippa furrowed her little brows, her big eyes looking at her mother with that strange intuition children always seem to have, that ability to sense something is wrong, even when no one says it out loud. "Are you coming with me, Mommy?" the child asked, and that clear little voice almost brought Delia to her knees. "Mommy has to stay here and help him get better, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to smooth her daughter's soft hair. "But I'll come get you soon, I promise." She held her child tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair as if trying to store it deep inside her chest, and she had to use every bit of strength she had to keep her voice from breaking. "You have to be good, listen to Miss Esther. And remember to take your inhaler with you. You remember, don't you?" Pippa nodded, then turned toward the 3 puppies looking up at her, and her eyes filled with tears. "If I go, who's going to play with them?" the little girl asked. Delia felt her throat close. "They'll stay here and wait for you," she said. "They'll help Mommy watch the house," and as if one of them understood her, a puppy sprang up and licked Pippa's cheek, making the little girl laugh through her tears. And that clear laugh was the most beautiful thing Delia had ever heard, and also the thing that broke her heart the most, because she knew she was sending her child away so that laugh could keep existing. She put a warm coat on her daughter, tucked the inhaler into her pocket, wrapped a scarf around the little girl's neck, and carried her out to the car Marlowe had already started in the yard, exhaust heat dissolving into the freezing air of the dying afternoon. She placed Pippa in the back seat, fastened her seatbelt, and kissed her forehead one last time. "Mommy loves you," she whispered, "more than anything in this whole world." "I love you, Mommy," Pippa answered, waving her tiny hand through the window glass. The car rolled away, leaving 2 long tracks in the snow, slowly disappearing behind the white-covered pines, and Delia stood there in the yard, watching until she could see nothing anymore, her breath turning into fragile white clouds in the air. Only when the car had fully vanished did she allow herself to turn away from the road, and when she did, something inside her had changed. The fear of a mother was still there, but now it had been locked behind a cold and sharpened resolve. Her daughter was safe. Now there was nothing left for her to hold back. She walked into the house, closed the door behind her, and looked at Lazar with an entirely new gaze. "Now," she said, "let's get ready to welcome our guests." Delia knew the land around her house better than anyone in the world. She knew every tree root, every hollow in the ground, every place where the ice ran thin because the small creek moved beneath the snow, and that was the only advantage she had over the men who were coming. She spread the rough map she had drawn by hand across the table, and beneath the oil lamp, she began showing Lazar the terrain. "They'll have to come from the east," she said, her finger tracing the lines, because that's the only direction a vehicle can get through. "The west side is a steep rock face and thick woods. No one with any sense would try to cut through there in the dark. And right in front of the house, under that smooth layer of snow, is where the creek runs underneath. The ice there is thin and weak. Anyone who doesn't know and steps on it will sink straight into the cold water below." Lazar watched her work, and in his eyes was a quiet admiration. "You're not just a nurse," he said. "I'm the daughter of a man who lived by the woods," Delia replied without lifting her head. "My father taught me that the person who understands the land is always stronger than the person who has more men." She set to work with the calm of someone used to facing matters of life and death. She took her father's old animal traps from the cellar, the ones she still used for foxes and weasels that raided the chicken coop, and placed them along the only approach, carefully hidden beneath the fresh snow. She brought out her medical flashlights and oil lamps, setting them far from the windows, casting their light toward the edge of the woods, so that anyone looking in would think someone was standing in those corners of the house, when in truth they were only shadows meant to deceive. Decoys, she explained briefly. So they'll aim where no one is. Lazar tried to help. He rose from the chair to fasten the door bolts, but as soon as he lifted his arm to shoulder height, the pain in his side stopped him short, his face turning white, and he had to grab the back of the chair to keep from falling. Delia was beside him in an instant, one hand supporting his elbow. "You need to sit down," she said, her voice hardening into the command of a nurse. "Your wound hasn't healed. You've lost too much blood, and if you strain yourself now, you won't have any strength left when they come. You're not the hero tonight, Lazar. You're a badly wounded man, and your job is to save what strength you still have until it's truly needed." Lazar looked at her, and instead of the prideful expression of a man used to giving orders, he only nodded faintly and sat down, accepting the truth that tonight, in this house, the one in command was not him, but the woman who had pulled him up from the bottom of the lake. Something softened between them in that moment, a silent trust that needed no words, woven from the harshness of the situation itself. When she handed him the cleaned gun, placing it into his hand with a look that said she trusted him to use it only to protect and not to harm, Lazar accepted it with the solemnity of accepting an oath. The three puppies, as if sensing the tension rising in the air, no longer played. They lay low near the door, ears pricked, eyes bright in the darkness, and Delia knew their sharp hearing would catch the footsteps of strangers long before any human could. They were her living alarm system, the smallest and most loyal soldiers she had. Then, as if the earth itself had taken a side in the siege to come, the wind began to rise again outside, another snowstorm sweeping in and lashing against the windows, and within moments the only light bulb still glowing in the house flickered, then went out. The power was gone. The whole house sank into a darkness broken only by the flickering firelight from the hearth and the weak glow of the oil lamps. Delia stood still for a moment in that darkness, listening to the wind howl and her own heart pound. Then she felt Lazar's hand brush lightly against hers, not an intimate gesture, but a silent assurance that she was not alone tonight. "Whatever happens," he said quietly in the dark, "I won't let them touch you. You saved my life without needing a reason. Let me repay that debt." Delia didn't pull her hand away. She stood there in her dark house, between a storm and a danger drawing closer, beside a man who only 2 days earlier had been a stranger sinking at the bottom of the lake. And for the first time in a very long while she felt she wasn't standing against the whole world alone. Outside, in the thick curtain of snow, the faint glow of several pairs of headlights began to appear at the end of the road. The three puppies were the first to know. Even before human ears could catch anything beyond the howl of the wind, they sprang up from where they had been lying near the door, the fur along their necks bristling, and a low growl rolled out of their small throats, that primitive warning sound animals have carried in their blood since the wild beginning of time. Delia froze, lifting one hand to signal Lazar to stay silent, and she listened. Through the gaps in the storm, she caught it, the crunch of snow, beneath heavy footsteps drawing closer, not one person but several, moving in a spread formation like men who had done this before. She blew out the nearest oil lamp, letting the house sink fully into darkness except for the firelight from the hearth, and she pulled Lazar back into the shadowed corner behind the thick stone wall, where no bullet from outside could reach. "They're here," she whispered, and Lazar nodded, his gun ready in his hand, though she could see he was forcing every bit of will he had into keeping his arm from shaking with exhaustion. Outside, the dark figures moved into the snow-covered yard, following the false pools of light Delia had set out, exactly as she had planned. She held her breath as she watched through the narrow crack of the window, and she saw them head toward the lamps, casting light into the far corners of the property, where they thought someone was hiding, completely unaware that every step was bringing them closer to the traps she had buried beneath the snow. Then it happened. A sharp metallic snap cracked through the night, followed by a cry of pain from a man who had just stepped into one of the traps hidden under the snow, and the whole formation jolted into confusion. A voice barked out an order to spread out, but in the darkness and the storm, they had no way of knowing which patches of ground were safe to step on. Another man, backing away too quickly to avoid his companion, planted his foot on the smooth stretch of snow directly in front of the house, the spot where the creek ran underneath, and the thin ice broke beneath his weight, dropping his leg into the freezing water up to the knee. He shouted from the cold that knifed through him and struggled wildly to pull himself free. The confidence of the hunters had vanished, replaced by the confusion of men suddenly realizing that the ground beneath them was not nearly as friendly as they had assumed. Huddled in the darkness, Delia felt a cold satisfaction. This was her ground. This was her forest, her snow. Every inch of earth she had crossed 1,000 times. And those men, though they came armed and in numbers, had set foot for the first time in a place where every advantage belonged to her. She pushed her father's old hunting rifle through the crack of the barely opened window, not to kill, but to warn, and she fired one shot into the air. The blast cracked through the storm with a booming force that sent the men outside, dropping flat into the snow, disoriented, unable to tell where the shot had come from, or how many people were fighting them. In those precious few seconds, their confidence collapsed. They had thought they were coming to finish off a wounded animal on its last breath, a lone fugitive, weak and cornered. They had not prepared for resistance, for traps, for treacherous ice, for a gunshot bursting out of the dark. The 3 puppies kept growling fiercely inside, that sound blending with the wind until the men outside grew even more unsettled, unable to guess how many living things might be waiting for them inside that blackened house. The leader of the group, a tall, dark figure hanging back behind the others, shouted for his men to fall back toward the tree line and regroup, and Delia watched the shadows stumble away from the yard, dragging with them the injured man and the one soaked from plunging through the creek. The first attack had been broken right at the threshold, before a single one of them had reached the house itself. Delia leaned back against the stone wall, her heart pounding, and glanced over at Lazar in the flickering firelight. "You just bought us some time," he said quietly, his voice full of admiration. "But they'll come back," she answered, "and this time they'll be more careful." She was right. Out there, in the darkness along the edge of the woods, the shadows were gathering again, and Delia knew that this pause was only the short breath before the true storm struck. She tightened her grip on the gun, listened to the pounding of her own heart, and waited. The second time, they were no longer naive. Delia heard the change in the way they approached, slower, more calculated, this time testing every step, avoiding suspicious patches of snow, and she knew her traps had lost the element of surprise. A dark figure pressed close against the wall of the house. Then a heavy blow sounded at the back door, the old wooden door Delia knew wouldn't hold for long. She had just enough time to pull Lazar deeper into the shadowed corner before the door burst open, and cold and darkness flooded in as 2 strangers crossed the threshold, guns raised in their hands, flashlight beams sweeping wildly across the small room. The space inside the house suddenly became cramped and suffocating. Every outdoor advantage Delia had known vanished, and now the confrontation had narrowed into a struggle in the dark between walls. Delia blew out the final oil lamp, pushing the whole room into near-total blackness, with only the fire from the hearth casting wavering shadows against the walls. And in that chaos, she understood that whoever knew the terrain better would win. She knew this house as well as she knew the palm of her hand, knew where the table stood, where the chair was, which narrow passage led to the back, while those men had to grope through unfamiliar darkness. One of them struck the table she had deliberately pushed into the middle of the path, stumbling and losing his balance, and Lazar, though weak, had been waiting for exactly that moment. He lunged out of the shadows with every ounce of strength he had left, throwing the full weight of his large body into the man, and though every movement tore through the pain in his side so brutally that he had to clench his teeth to keep from collapsing, he still managed to bring the man down, wrench the gun from his hand, and fling it away into the dark. But the price showed itself immediately. Lazar staggered, one hand gripping his side, his breathing broken and uneven, and Delia could see clearly that he was fading fast, that his wounded body could not carry him through another fight. The second man turned toward Lazar as he swayed, and in that instant Delia didn't have time to think. She grabbed the oil lamp she had just extinguished and threw it straight at him, striking his shoulder hard enough to throw off his aim, so his shot buried itself in the wooden wall instead of Lazar's body. The black room filled with chaotic noise, furniture crashing, breath rasping, bodies colliding, and amid all of it Delia felt a rough hand seize her arm and yank her backward. She fought with all the strength of a mother battling for life, her nails clawing, her elbow driving hard behind her, and she had learned how to defend herself through the lonely years in these deep woods. But the man was stronger, and she knew she was slowly losing the uneven struggle. At that desperate moment, the front door flew open again, and a new figure rushed in with the speed and force of a storm. Marlowe. He had returned, exactly as promised, just in time after placing Pippa safely in Miss Esther's hands and racing back through the snow. His arrival changed everything inside the cramped room. He moved with the cold skill of a man who had lived through countless moments like this, and in a heartbeat he had subdued the man holding Delia, freeing her and shoving her back toward Lazar. "Get him out back," Marlowe shouted over the chaos. "I'll hold them." Delia wrapped an arm around Lazar, who was almost collapsing, and dragged him back toward the safety of the stone wall, feeling through his clothes that his body was burning with fever and trembling from exhaustion. "Are you all right?" she asked urgently, her nurse's hands automatically checking whether the stitches in his side had torn open during the struggle. "I'm alive," Lazar answered, his voice hoarse, but his steel-gray eyes still shining with stubborn endurance. "Because of you. Always because of you." In the front room, Marlowe was facing the remaining men, and the sounds of the fight had not yet ended, but now the balance had shifted, and for the first time Delia allowed herself to believe they might survive this night. But then, through the broken window frame, she saw a new figure step into the snow-covered yard, standing calm and unhurried, the posture of a man who knew he was the one truly in control. And beside her, she heard Lazar breathe out a name filled with all the hatred he had been holding back for days. Cassius. Cassius stepped into the dark room, with a calm that seemed to thicken the air, and Delia knew at once that this man was nothing like the henchman struggling with Marlowe in the front of the house. He didn't carry the urgency of a hunter, but the cold ease of a man who believed every piece on the board was already in his hands. The firelight from the hearth fell across his face, a face that carried faint traces of Lazar's features, the same blood, but warped by greed, and his eyes swept the room until they stopped on his cousin leaning against the wall, wounded and exhausted. "You really are hard to kill, Lazar," Cassius said, his voice so soft it was chilling. "You should stayed at the bottom of the lake. Everything would been so beautifully clean." Lazar forced himself upright, shielding Delia behind him with his large body, though every breath he took was labored. "This is between the two of us, Cassius," he said. "She has nothing to do with it. She only made the mistake of saving me. Let her go." Cassius tilted his head, his gaze shifting to Delia, and in that cold look she read a calculation without the slightest trace of feeling, the way a man looks at a human being as nothing more than a problem that needs to be erased. "This woman has seen too much," he said. "She knows my face. She knows my name. You understand the rules, Lazar. No witnesses left behind." And Delia saw him slowly raise the gun, the black barrel turning toward her with terrible calm, and in that moment that seemed to stretch forever, she thought of Pippa, thought of her daughter's little face, thought that at least her child was safe somewhere far from here, and that was the only thing that kept her from feeling any regret. But that moment had not yet ended when Lazar moved. With everything left in his ruined body, he turned and lunged toward Delia, knocking her down behind the thick chair, using his own body as a shield between her and the enemy. A shot exploded inside the closed room, and Delia felt Lazar's weight collapse heavily over her, heard a low, strangled groan catch in his throat. He had been hit. He had taken what was meant for her. After that, everything happened at once. Marlowe's roar came from the next room as he rushed forward and seized Cassius before he could fire a second shot, grappling with him and tearing the gun from his hand in a brief and brutal fight. But Delia could barely hear anything anymore, because her entire world had narrowed around the man lying motionless over her. She slipped out from beneath his weight, dropped to her knees beside him, and her nurse's hands began working before her mind could catch up. "Lazar," she called, her voice breaking, though her hands were strangely steady. "Look at me. Can you hear me? You don't get to give up, do you understand me?" She tore the fabric open, pressed both hands hard over the new wound to stop the bleeding, pouring all her weight and all her will down into that pressure the way she had done on the first night by the lake. "You stubborn fool," she said, tears streaming down her face, yet her voice kept ordering him to live. "Why did you do that? Why did you take the shot for me?" Lazar opened his eyes, those steel-gray eyes now dimmed with pain but still fixed on her face. and a faint, fragile smile touched his lips. "Because you saved me without needing a reason," he whispered, each word broken and uneven. "I only wanted, once in my life, to do the right thing without counting the cost. You taught me that, Delia." "Stop talking," she choked out. "Save your strength, you're going to live. I won't let you die on my floor, do you hear me? Not after everything we've been through." And as she knelt there in the flickering firelight, her blood-soaked hands pressed tightly against the wound of the man who had taken a bullet meant for her, Delia understood that the circle had closed. She had pulled him up from the bottom of the frozen lake, and now he had repaid that debt with his own life. Two people who had once been strangers, who had come from two worlds that could not have been farther apart, were now bound to each other by something deeper than gratitude. Behind her, Marlowe had finally pinned Cassius to the floor. The siege was over, but the battle to keep Lazar alive had only just begun. Marlowe held Cassius pinned to the floor, and the remaining henchmen, once they saw their leader subdued and realized the ambush had failed completely, fled into the snow, leaving their commander in the hands of the very people they had come to kill. While Delia still knelt beside Lazar, her hands pressed tightly over the wound to stop the bleeding, she heard Lazar speak, weakly but clearly, ordering Marlowe to do something she had not expected. "Don't," Lazar said when he saw the cold intent flash in Marlowe's eyes, the kind of intent people from their world so often chose. "Don't kill him." Marlowe looked up at him, his expression confused, because to him the natural law of that world was that a traitor paid in blood, and no one would have blamed Lazar if he had ordered the death of the man who had sent him to the bottom of the lake. "He tried to kill you," Marlowe said quietly. "He deserves to die." "Perhaps he does," Lazar replied, his voice breaking from the pain, but every word still firm. "But if I kill him, then how am I any different from him? I've lived my whole life by that law, life for life, blood for blood, and it only brought me to the bottom of a frozen lake. I'm tired of it, Marlowe." He turned his head to look at Delia, and in those steel-gray eyes, dimmed by exhaustion, there was a new light she had never seen before. "Someone just showed me that there's still another way to live." Delia gave his hand a gentle squeeze and said nothing, but she understood that she had just witnessed a man choosing to become a better version of himself in the very moment when it would have been easiest to surrender to hatred. Lazar gestured toward the small memory card he had kept hidden, the second set of books he had guarded for years like a weapon for survival. "Everything is in there," he told Marlowe. "Every transaction, every flow of money, every name, including what Cassius has done. Call the federal people, not the local police. They may have been bought. Take it straight higher up, to people he can't reach. Let the law handle him, and let it handle me too if it must. I've been running for too long." Delia looked at him, stunned by what she had just heard. This man, the crime boss half of New England feared, was willingly turning over the thing that could destroy his enemy to justice, instead of taking revenge with his own hands. And he was ready to face the consequences of his own sins as well. That wasn't surrender. It was a choice, perhaps the bravest choice a man like him had ever made. In the hours that followed, as the storm outside finally began to fade, everything unfolded quietly and with order. Marlowe reached the people Lazar trusted, and before the sky had fully brightened, federal vehicles appeared on the snowy road, their lights flashing silently in the early morning. Cassius was taken away in handcuffs, and when he passed the place where Lazar lay waiting for the medics, he threw his cousin a look filled with hatred, but Lazar only looked back at him with a calm that was almost pity. "I once loved you like my own brother," he said softly. "I hope one day you understand that what you lost wasn't the ports." Cassius did not answer, and then he was led outside, disappearing from their lives, not by a bullet in the dark, but beneath the weight of the law and evidence that could not be denied. Delia stood at the threshold, a blanket net wrapped around her shoulders, and looked out at Cedar Hollow Lake, where everything had begun. The first light of dawn was spreading a soft, pale pink over the ice, and the water that had once swallowed a living man now lay quiet and peaceful beneath a brightening sky. She thought of the night she had rushed into that freezing water, without knowing who she was pulling out, thought of everything that had happened since then, and realized that sometimes justice did not come from punishment, but from the truth finally being brought into the light. Behind her, the medics were caring for Lazar, and for the first time in days, Delia felt she could breathe. The nightmare was over. But as she watched the man being lifted onto the stretcher, she knew that some things between them had only just begun. It took many weeks before Lazar recovered enough to sit up without wincing in pain, and throughout that time, something quietly changed between the two of them. Pippa had returned home safely, filling the cabin with laughter and mischief alongside the 3 puppies, who were now noticeably bigger, and Lazar, the man who had once made an entire region afraid, became strangely, awkwardly gentle whenever the little girl ran over to show him a new drawing. One afternoon, when rare winter sunlight streamed through the window, Lazar told Delia something he had been thinking about for a long time. "I had people look into you," he began, and when he saw Delia frown, he raised a hand to reassure her. "Not to pry, but to understand. I know what happened in Chicago. I know what they did to you, that doctor, that hospital, the blacklist that buried your career only because you dared to tell the truth. Delia, what they did to you was unjust, and I have enough lawyers, enough resources, to reopen the entire matter. I can clear your name, help you practice again, make the people who destroyed you answer for what they did. And the bank notice, the foreclosure order on this house," he continued, his voice softening, "that is only a small number to me. I can make it disappear tomorrow, so you and Pippa never have to worry about having a roof over your heads again." Delia sat in silence for a long while, and all kinds of tangled emotions rose inside her. That offer, to a woman as exhausted by burden and fear as she was, should have felt like a dream come true. But she shook her head, slowly and firmly. "I won't take your money, Lazar," she said. "You surprise me," he admitted. "Most people would snatch it up immediately." "That's exactly the problem," Delia replied, and her voice carried the quiet strength that had carried her through all her darkest years. "My whole life, other people have decided my fate for me. The hospital decided my voice didn't matter. The blacklist decided I didn't deserve to do the work I loved. The bank decided I'm about to lose my home. I'm so tired of having my life sit in someone else's hands, whether that person wants to destroy me or save me. If I let you use money to erase all my problems, then I'm only trading one kind of dependence for another." She stopped, and when she spoke again, her eyes were wet, but her voice didn't tremble. "I don't need a rich man to come save me like some prince in a fairy tale. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. Lazar looked at her, and instead of disappointment, deep respect rose across his face. "Then what do you need?" he asked gently. "Because I know you aren't foolish enough to refuse every form of help out of pride." Delia smiled, a tired but sincere smile, the first one she had ever given him. "The truth," she said. "That is all I want. I don't need your money to pay the bank debt. I'll find a way to handle that myself the way I always have. But your lawyers, the evidence you can reach, help me reopen the case in Chicago. Not so you can give me my innocence as a gift, but so I can have the chance to win it back myself, so I can stand before the board and speak the truth they buried. And so this time, justice stands on my side. I don't want you to rebuild my life for me. I only want you to give me back the hammer so I can build it myself." Lazar looked at her in silence for a long time, then he nodded, and in that nod was complete understanding. "You know," he said quietly, "I have spent my whole life used to people coming to me for what I can give them. Money, power, protection. You are the first person to look at me and want only one thing, to be respected as an equal human being." He held out his hand, not as a gesture of giving, but as a covenant between 2 people standing on equal ground. "Then I'll help you win back your voice," he said. "Not as a gift, but as repayment from a man who owes you his life. The rest, you will do yourself." Delia placed her calloused hand in his, and for the first time in many years, she felt she was not receiving pity, but stepping into a relationship where, at last, she was being seen exactly as the person she truly was. A resilient woman who had fallen many times, but had never once surrendered. Lazar Vukovic's transformation did not happen overnight, and that was exactly what made it real. A person cannot wash away an entire lifetime with a single vow or one moment of awakening, and Lazar understood that better than anyone. There were nights when he sat for a very long time by the window, looking out at the lake, wrestling with himself, with the things he had done in the years before, with the part of him that had grown used to solving every problem through power and fear. But every time that happened, he thought of Delia plunging into the freezing water to pull up a stranger without needing to know who he was, thought of the way she treated him as a human being and not as a crime boss, and in that he found something that anchored him and kept him from drifting back toward the old darkness. The first thing he did was the hardest. He began dismantling, piece by piece, the underground empire his father had left behind, and that he had spent his youth building. The shadowy routes were cut off, the illegal dealings were ended, and what remained of the Vukovic company was restructured into a legitimate and transparent transportation business, a real logistics company that carried only things that could be declared in the full light of day. Many people from his old world thought he had gone mad, that he was throwing away a fortune, but Lazar had never felt clearer in his mind. For the first time in his life, he went to sleep without resting his head beside a gun. But the most meaningful thing, the thing Delia knew had touched the deepest part of him, was the foundation he created. He used part of his fortune to establish a medical fund, an organization dedicated to helping poor patients without insurance, the people the system was willing to abandon just as it had once abandoned his sister many years before. He named the foundation after his sister, and on the day the sign was hung, Delia saw that large man stand silently for a long time before the name carved on it, his steel-gray eyes shining with something she had never seen before. "She died because no one was willing to save her," he said quietly, his voice tightening. "My whole life, I took revenge on the world that killed her by becoming even crueler than it was. But you showed me that true revenge isn't spreading more darkness. It's doing what someone should have done for my sister. Saving the people no one else is willing to save." Delia placed her hand on his shoulder, and she said nothing, because she understood that there were moments when words only diminished what was sacred. She looked at this man, and she did not see a crime boss trying to atone, but a human being who had finally found his way back to the best part of himself, the part pain and power had buried for so many years. Life in the cabin by the lake slowly returned to peace, but it was a new kind of peace, fuller than before. Pippa, now completely safe and healthy, clung to Lazar with the innocent ease only children possess, calling him funny little nicknames and making him sit for hours while she told him stories. And Lazar, a man who had never known the tenderness of a home, received all of it like someone learning how to live from the beginning again. He learned how to chop wood for the fireplace, learned how to sit in silence beside Delia on evenings when snow fell beyond the windows, learned how to laugh honestly instead of with the calculating smile of a man in power. One evening, when Pippa was fast asleep and the 3 dogs lay curled beside the fireplace, Lazar looked at Delia and said something he had never said to anyone. "You know, before the night you pulled me out of that lake, I believed my life could only end one way, sooner or later, with a bullet or with cold water. I never thought there could be any other road for a man like me." He stopped, his eyes softening in a way none of his enemies could ever have imagined. "You didn't only pull me out of that water, Delia. You pulled me out of the man I had become." Delia smiled, and outside, Cedar Hollow Lake quietly reflected the moonlight, the water that had once nearly taken everything now lying peaceful like a promise that even the things that seemed frozen forever could one day thaw and begin to flow again. A year passed, and winter returned to Cedar Hollow Lake, but this time it carried an entirely different face. The snow still fell in a white blur, the lake still froze silently beneath the gray sky. But the small cabin on the shore was no longer the lonely refuge of a desperate woman. It had become a real home, warm with lamplight and alive with laughter. Pippa, now 7 years old, healthy and full of life, was running through the snow yard with her 3 loyal friends. Smoke, Birch, and Belle were no longer the tiny, trembling creatures that had once struggled in the freezing water. They had grown into 3 strong and beautiful dogs, always close beside the little girl, still carrying the protective instinct that had made them choose this family from the very first night. Pippa's giggles mingled with the dog's joyful barking in the clear, cold air, and it was the most beautiful sound that house had ever known. Inside, Delia was hanging a new certificate on the wall, the license to practice she had won back by her own strength. With the support of the lawyers Lazar had introduced to her, she had returned to Chicago, had stood before the medical board, and this time, she had not been alone, had not been crushed beneath someone else's power. The truth that people had buried for years was finally brought into the light, her name was cleared, and the doctor from long ago had been forced to face the consequences of his negligence. Delia had not taken a single dollar to rebuild her life. She had won it back herself, piece by piece, with calloused hands and a will that had never surrendered, and now, on the door of the cabin, a small modest sign had been hung. A little clinic where she cared for both people and animals from all across the countryside around the lake, where she continued doing the work she had loved with her whole heart, the work no blacklist could ever take from her again. As the sun began to set, a familiar car turned onto the snowy road, and Lazar stepped out. He was no longer the crime boss the whole region feared, no longer carrying the cold, dangerous air of a man who always had to watch his back. He came like an ordinary man returning home after a day of honest work, his logistics company now operating transparently in the full light of day, and the medical foundation named after his sister had already saved hundreds of people the system had once been ready to abandon. When Pippa saw him, she cried out happily and ran toward him, the 3 dogs trotting after her, and Lazar knelt to catch the little girl with a warm, sincere smile, the smile of a man who had finally found something money and power had never been able to buy for him. Delia stood at the doorway watching the scene, and her heart filled with a peace she had believed for so long she would never feel again. She looked out toward the lake, where everything had begun on that fateful snowy night long ago. The water that had once roared, once swallowed, once nearly taken everything, now lay still beneath the sunset. And she knew that when spring came, the ice would melt, the water would flow again, and life would grow once more. Just like 2 people who had been frozen by life and by unjust systems, a woman stripped of her voice and a man imprisoned in the darkness of his own making, had finally learned how to thaw, how to forgive, how to live again. Because no heart is so frozen that it can never be warmed again, and no person is so lost that they can never find the way home, once someone is willing to reach out a hand without asking who they are. The story of Delia and Lazar reminds us of one simple yet profound truth, that unconditional kindness has the power to heal wounds that seem as if they will never heal, that a person's dignity does not lie in whether they are rich or poor, strong or weak, but in how they treat one another, and that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to believe in goodness to change an entire fate. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with the people you love to spread this beautiful message. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to more meaningful and compelling stories. We truly hope to know how you feel about this story, so please leave a comment and share the thoughts that come from deep within your heart, because every line you share is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, and may every day be filled with joy, peace, and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.